Hi, welcome. I am Hannah. This is the Theology Therapist YouTube channel. Today I wanted to talk about something that is a little bit touchy, a lot of it touchy, but has been coming up in tons of my therapy sessions and is really near and dear to my heart. I just want to talk a little bit about what I think religious people need to know about the Israel Hamas war. The first thing is that there is a really complicated history in this land and this people. I took a travel seminar course in grad school, and so I spent a whole semester studying the history and then went to Israel Palestine and experienced different lectures and seminars and experiences relating to the history and the culture and the situation now. Back then, when I went, I spent months doing this. Even that is not enough. I just really think it's important to caution ourselves that before we speak, because this history is really complicated and it is really easy to, especially on social media, jump in with what your opinion and use it as a place to vent, which I guess you can do that, but know that it does impact people. It impacts people who see it and who read it, and it can actually create harm. At East Bay Meditation Center, they have come up with agreements for multicultural interactions, and I think that they are actually really applicable and helpful here. I'm not going to go through all of them with you right now. Put a link in the description so that you can find that on your own. But the one that I did want to highlight that I think is really appropriate for this situation is this agreement to move up and move back. Essentially, it's about encouraging full participation by all people, taking note of who's speaking and who isn't. And if you tend to speak often, consider moving back and vice versa. So if you find yourself somebody who is doing a lot of talking, and I mean this in the context of the conflict in Gaza, is if you are taking a stand about something that you don't have any personal connection to, and you are doing a lot of talking and not a lot of listening, I would really encourage you to consider this agreement of moving up and moving back so that others can move up. Because listening to not just the side that you agree with, but listening to lots of people, lots of voices, lots of experiences is just as or more important than talking. I wanted to make a little bit of a note about this because I talked about this with some of my clients in highlighting the tactics of indoctrination, specifically in thought reform and how thought reform happens in black and white thinking. Now, those are two aspects of mind control or simply indoctrinating someone. And I think what's super important is understanding that you can have different beliefs but still be operating under a tactic of indoctrination. For example, someone could be raised like Zionist Jewish and have those beliefs and then go through a sort of deconstruction of those beliefs process and then become anti-state of Israel, pro-Palestinian liberation, and yet be using in this thinking pattern the same tactic of indoctrination that happened in the beginning with the Zionism. That same tactic can happen over here with the sort of Palestinian liberation. So I'm not making a comment here, just to be clear, about those beliefs, the content, the message of those beliefs. I'm not making a comment about that. What I am making a comment about is the pattern of thinking, the way of thinking, the tactic of indoctrination. That stays the same unless you do serious unindoctrination work, which I do with clients, and you can find some other therapists who do that. Unless you're doing some serious unindoctrinating, you often keep the indoctrination but change the content of the belief. I think that's really important because the way that you hold beliefs is another sort of tactic or sign of indoctrination. The way you hold the belief, how you are expected to believe. So you might be asking me, why is this important as it relates to the conflict in Gaza and the war between Israel and Hamas? This is important for not only the people living in that context, but I would argue probably more important if you are, say, living in the US and you're removed from that. This is so important because if you are still living with the tactics of indoctrination as operative, you're going to have difficulty with some things. And those things are going to be unable to tolerate difference, feeling isolated, and ruining relationships. I see this all the time, is that because indoctrination cannot tolerate difference as like a method, difference in indoctrination is not allowed. You can't indoctrinate when there's difference. You can't do that. And so there has to be this insulation, this isolation from other ways of being or thinking. Because of that, you are unable to tolerate diversity. You're unable to tolerate people thinking differently than you. This applies to a lot of people. Think about politics currently. Think about religion. This applies to a lot of people. And whenever you believe differently, you're coming up with people who disagree, this can be an isolating experience. And not only the isolation, but it can also ruin relationships because remember, indoctrination cannot tolerate difference. It has to be insulated. And so if there is someone in your life, a loved one, who is espousing different beliefs or a different way of living, you are going to have to reject that sort of person or cut them out of your life because that doesn't line up with this framework. What that might look like is if you are pro-Palestinian liberation and you meet someone who is pro-Israel, you might cut them out and vice versa. Because this tactic of indoctrination is the same. I hope that makes sense. It's not about the beliefs themselves. It's about the indoctrination that happens. The same way that thoughts are reformed, the same way that they are kept that way, happens on both sides. Whether that's about Israel-Palestine or whether that's about Trump or Biden or Republican or Democrat, that happens. And we're going to see a lot of that, not only as it relates to Israel Hamas, but in the coming presidential election. So you might be wondering if you're not mad at me yet and still tracking with me, how do you approach this difficult situation without indoctrination? And I'll tell you what my clients and I are doing. We are naming the suffering and we are sitting with complexity. Yeah, it is much harder to deal with the discomfort of complexity and of suffering than it is to have extreme black and white beliefs. Israel is wrong. They're doing this. Palestinian people or Hamas is this. It is much easier to have unilateral beliefs than it is to sit with the complexity of being personally impacted for a lot of people that I know, living there, having loved ones who live there, feeling a personal connection in some way. It is hard to sit with the deep suffering and the complexity of the situation. But the way to cope with this war and these types of situations, instead of operating with indoctrination, is to hold complexity. That's a lot. It is a lot to even consider accepting or bringing into, not like immediately rejecting, beliefs that challenge yours. For me and my clients, this is a practice. This is a practice that is grounding during these times. and is really that anchor when there are extremely big emotions. But it's that anchor that allows us to move up and allows us to move back and allow others or those who need to move up. I know it's a lot. I am going to put a link in the description for the agreements for multicultural interactions. You can take a look at that. Feel free to leave me a comment respectfully below if you've tried something like this before, if this is difficult for you. I love to hear from you. I love your comments. I will respond to them. And I just want to send a little reminder, a couple of ways to stay connected. You can join the newsletter that I send out. You can take the quiz on my website for determining if you have religious trauma. It was so good to see you again. If you are a returning friend, and if this is your first time, I hope to see you soon. Be well, friends.